Afghanistan has known decades of war, but few years were as cruel as when the Taliban ruled. They controlled lives and terrorized entire communities. From public floggings to secret killings, from shutting schools to forcing families into impossible choices. Their reign left deep scars that still haunt the country today. In the early 1990s, Afghanistan was already torn apart by years of civil war. Warlords fought each other, cities were destroyed, and ordinary people lived in constant fear. Into this chaos stepped the Taliban, a group of students from religious schools, mostly in southern Afghanistan. They promised to bring peace and order to a country that had known nothing but violence for so long. At first, some people actually welcomed them. The idea of having roads that weren't blocked by fighting and neighborhoods where people could walk without fear felt like hope, but that hope didn't last long. By 1996, the Taliban had captured Kabul, the capital, and declared themselves the rulers of Afghanistan. They set up a government based on their strict interpretation of Islamic law, which they called Sharia. But the laws they enforced were harsh and extreme. Almost immediately, girls and women were banned from going to school or holding jobs. A woman couldn't even step outside without a male guardian, usually a father, brother, or husband. Streets, once alive with women carrying groceries or going to work, became eerily empty. People in Kabul were even told to cover all windows so no one could see inside homes where women lived. For many Afghan women, daily life turned into a kind of invisible prison, trapped inside walls, with no freedom to move or speak publicly. The punishments for breaking the Taliban's rules were terrifyingly brutal. They didn't hesitate to hurt or kill people for what seemed like tiny offenses. In one shocking case from 1996, a woman in Kabul had the tip of her thumb cut off just for wearing nail polish. Danger wasn't only for women. One young girl later shared a horrifying memory of the night the Taliban came to her home and shot her father because he had allowed her to go to school. Any man could abuse a female relative without fear of punishment, and a woman who reported violence risked being accused of adultery. Incredibly, women who suffered rape could be charged as criminals and even stoned for so-called moral crimes. In 1998, the Taliban carried out one of the most horrifying attacks on civilians in Afghanistan. On August 8th that year, they took control of the northern city of Mazar-e-Sharif. Almost immediately, the violence began. According to Human Rights Watch, Taliban fighters went door to door, searching for men they considered enemies. They focused especially on ethnic and religious minorities, with Hazara men and boys being targeted more than anyone else. Families lived in terror as fighters dragged men out of their homes. Some were executed on the spot, while others were taken to holding areas under terrible conditions. In some cases, thousands of Hazara men and boys were stuffed into shipping containers with barely any air to breathe. On just 2 trucks, almost everyone inside either suffocated or died from heat stroke, trapped in darkness and crushing heat. The scale of the violence was staggering. By the end of the massacre, at least 2,000 civilians had been killed. Entire families were shattered in a single day, leaving survivors with fear, grief, and horror that would last their entire lives. Punishments for civilians were also gruesome. Men caught stealing had their hands or feet cut off. Adulterers could face stoning or execution. In those years, the Taliban publicly lashed people in stadiums and even buried some alive for unproven sins. These acts were meant to terrorize the population. In homes across Afghanistan, families lived in constant fear of surprise raids, summary judgments, and sudden executions. But everything changed in 2001. That year, a foreign coalition, led by the United States, launched a full-scale invasion of Afghanistan. The attack was sparked by the September 11th terrorist attack in the US, and the Taliban had been harboring Al-Qaeda, the group responsible. The coalition's forces moved with speed and precision. Within days, they targeted Taliban military bases, key government buildings, and strategic cities. Their goal was to dismantle the Taliban's control and capture their leaders. Kabul, the capital, which had long been under Taliban rule, soon faced the overwhelming pressure of advancing coalition troops. Government offices emptied, checkpoints vanished, and the streets that had been eerily quiet under Taliban patrols began to stir with life. The Taliban government collapsed almost overnight. Leaders and top commanders fled. Many retreated to the rugged mountains of southern Afghanistan or across the border into Pakistan, where they could hide and plan for the future. For ordinary Afghans, the arrival of foreign troops brought a mix of relief and cautious hope. People who had been too afraid to step outside their homes began to walk through their neighborhoods freely. Girls returned to schools that had been closed for years, and women cautiously went back to work, reclaiming parts of life that had been stolen from them. But the terror was far from over. After vanishing into the mountains and refugee camps, the Taliban quietly regrouped as an insurgent force. Over the next 2 decades, they waged a bloody war across Afghanistan. Their war was brutal and often targeted civilians. Bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings became commonplace. Every year, thousands of Afghan civilians were killed or wounded in Taliban attacks. Taliban fighters showed they had learned the lessons of their past terror. They deliberately targeted anyone they saw as cooperating with government or foreign forces. In May 2019, for example, Taliban militants stormed the Kabul office of a US-funded aid agency with guns and grenades, leaving chaos in their wake. 3 aid workers were killed in the attack, and others barely escaped with their lives. The attack sent a chilling message that even people working to help civilians weren't safe. But that was only the beginning. Later that September, the Taliban carried out another brutal assault in the heart of the capital. A suicide bomber detonated explosives near Afghanistan's defense ministry, killing 22 people and wounding dozens more. These weren't isolated incidents. Across the country, the Taliban targeted anyone they saw as a threat or an opponent. Schoolboys walking to class, teachers trying to educate children, politicians trying to govern, and journalists reporting the news were all ambushed and murdered. Roadside bombs became a daily hazard on Afghan streets, hidden along highways and village paths, ready to strike without warning. Suicide vests were worn by attackers who had no hesitation about killing themselves, along with dozens of innocent people. They also carried out public executions and revenge killings, even as an insurgency. In March 2007, Ajmal Naqshbandi, a well-known Afghan freelance journalist and translator, was working in Helmand province in southern Afghanistan. He was there to report on the war and what was happening to ordinary people. That day, he was traveling with Daniel Mastrogiacomo, an experienced Italian-Swiss reporter, and their driver, Syed Aga. They were heading into an area controlled by the Taliban, hoping to interview Taliban commanders and tell the world what life was like on the ground. But on March 4, 2007, they were stopped at a Taliban checkpoint and taken captive by fighters loyal to the feared commander, Mullah Dadullah. The militants accused them of spying and marched them into Taliban territory, holding them as hostages to gain political leverage. In the days that followed, the Taliban made clear what they wanted. They demanded that the Afghan government free certain senior Taliban prisoners in exchange for the hostages' lives. Over 2 weeks, negotiators worked day and night. Family members, diplomats, and Afghan officials tried to convince the Taliban to release the men. The Taliban eventually agreed to free Mastrogiacomo, but only after the Afghan government released 5 Taliban prisoners from jail. On March 19, 2007, Mastrogiacomo was freed and flown out of Afghanistan. In the meantime, Syed Aga, the driver, was killed by the Taliban not long after the kidnapping. His body was later returned to his family. The militants said he was a spy, though those who knew him said he had simply been doing his job. After Mastrogiacomo was released, the Taliban renewed their demand. They wanted 2 more high-ranking Taliban commanders freed in exchange for Naqshbandi. The Afghan government refused to agree to another prisoner swap. Days passed with no resolution. As time went on, it became clear that the Taliban were losing patience. Local media reported that Taliban leaders warned that if their demands were not met, they would execute Naqshbandi. Then on April 8, 2007, the nightmare became real. In the Garmsir district of Helmand, the Taliban carried out their threat. They took Ajmal Naqshbandi out into an open field and beheaded him with a knife. The killing was meant to be a public act of terror. Naqshbandi's life ended not far from where he had been kidnapped more than a month earlier. His execution was ruled a cold murder. The cruelty still didn't stop. In August 2010, the Taliban carried out one of the most brutal punishments seen in Afghanistan since they were driven from power in 2001. The incident happened in Cadiz district of Badghis province, a remote and sparsely populated area in the northwest of the country that was largely under Taliban control. A local Taliban commander accused a 40-year-old widow named Bibi Sanaubar of having an illicit affair and becoming pregnant as a result. They claimed her pregnancy was proof of the relationship, even though there was no official court, trial, or legal process recognized by the Afghan government. For 3 days, Taliban fighters kept her in captivity before any punishment was carried out, holding her while they prepared for what they called a public trial. Police later confirmed these details and said she was detained in that rural area before the execution took place. On August 8, 2010, Taliban fighters marched Sanaubar into an open public space where people from nearby villages and insurgent fighters had gathered. Standing before them, she was accused of breaking the Taliban's strict rules against relationships outside marriage. Instead of any real legal process, the militants first flogged her 200 times with whips in front of the watching crowd. After the flogging, Mullah Muhammad Yusuf, the local Taliban commander, personally carried out the final act. He fired 3 shots into her head, killing her on the spot. Her body was then left behind when the fighters moved on, leaving behind villagers who had watched the entire scene unfold. What made this killing even more disturbing to people across Afghanistan was the fate of the man the Taliban claimed was involved with Sanaubar. According to police reports, he was never punished for the same accusation. He was said to have escaped or simply not faced the brutal punishment that Sanaubar received. This stark difference, a woman tortured and executed, while the man walked free, highlighted the cruel and unequal way the Taliban applied their version of justice. The execution shocked people in Afghanistan and beyond because it echoed the harshest elements of the Taliban's earlier rule from 1996 to 2001, when public lashings, stonings, and executions were common under their interpretation of Sharia law. Many Afghans had hoped that that kind of brutality was gone, but this killing proved, even years after the Taliban lost national power, that their fighters in rural areas still had the strength and will to carry out violent punishments in front of ordinary villagers. International forces and Afghan authorities condemned what happened. Rights groups warned that such public executions and floggings were not only violations of human dignity, but also clear violations of human rights. Some local religious leaders pointed out that this form of punishment went against basic Islamic principles, even as the Taliban insisted it was justified. Just a week later, in mid-August 2010, another brutal act followed in the north of the country. In Dasht-i-Archi district of Kunduz province, a young man and woman were publicly stoned to death by Taliban fighters after being accused of eloping together. Rights groups later confirmed that this was the first public stoning in Afghanistan since the Taliban's fall in 2001, showing that these ancient and violent punishments were being used again by insurgents in areas where they held power. Throughout the insurgency years, peace talks and peace deals were announced several times, but the Taliban didn't stop fighting. Night raids, ambushes, and bomb attacks continued well into 2020. As the world negotiated with them, the Taliban quietly kept killing Afghans who were seen as their enemies, whether soldiers, police, villagers cooperating with the government, or activists speaking up for rights. Day after day, Afghan families remained at risk. And if all that wasn't enough, the worst came in 2021. In August that year, after nearly 20 years of war and foreign troops in the country, US and NATO forces pulled out, and the Taliban came back faster than anyone expected. In just a few days, they swept through cities and towns, and on August 15th, they walked into Kabul, almost without anyone stopping them. The Afghan government fell apart. President Ashraf Ghani fled, and the Taliban declared themselves in charge once again. Within weeks, they began undoing 20 years of progress. Girls and women were told they could no longer attend secondary schools, and later, even universities were closed to them. Hundreds of thousands of girls who were about to finish middle school and go to high school suddenly had their education stopped. This wasn't a small change. It affected millions of girls across the country, taking away the chance to learn, dream, and plan for the future. At the same time, women were pushed out of workplaces where they had finally started to make progress. Many had become doctors, teachers, engineers, journalists, and civil servants. After August 2021, the Taliban issued orders stopping women from working in most government roles and many private jobs. Essentially half the adult population was told they no longer had a place in public life. On top of that, the Taliban restricted women's movement. Even simple tasks like buying food or going to the market became dangerous challenges. The sudden loss of freedoms touched almost every part of daily life. Some women tried to protest these rules in the streets, speaking out against the bans on school and work. But the Taliban's response was fast and brutal. Security forces fired live bullets into crowds of women, sometimes killing or seriously injuring people who were just standing up for themselves. One well-known case early on involved Mursal Nabizada, a former member of parliament who was reportedly killed during these crackdowns. These early restrictions were only the beginning. Over time, the Taliban began bringing back more of the harsh punishments they were infamous for in the 1990s. In late 2022, Afghan news reported that public floggings were happening again. In Takhar province, the Taliban-led Supreme Court said 19 people, including 9 women, were publicly lashed multiple times for alleged crimes like adultery and theft. A few days later, in Logar province, 14 people, including 3 women, were lashed in a football stadium in front of officials, local fighters, and villagers. The cruelty went far beyond lashings. Reports from human rights groups, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, showed that the Taliban's violence spread deep and wide. In Panjshir province, where some anti-Taliban fighters stayed after Kabul fell, witnesses reported systematic abuse. Men and boys suspected of supporting the resistance were rounded up, tied, and taken to mountainsides where they were shot. Homes were burned, neighborhoods destroyed, and thousands of men were detained without trial or legal process. Amnesty International called these actions war crimes, pointing to unlawful killings, torture, and mass arbitrary arrests. For families caught in these crackdowns, the terror was very personal. Many people were arrested, disappeared, or killed not because they had done anything wrong, but because they were connected to the former government, local resistance fighters, or the old Afghan security forces. Human Rights Watch reported that in the first years after the Taliban came back, hundreds of extrajudicial killings and arbitrary arrests happened, including the deaths of former army, police, and intelligence officers. Many victims were never formally charged with anything. Some just vanished, leaving families with no idea what had happened to their loved ones. The Taliban didn't stop at controlling women or punishing civilians publicly. Their control touched every part of life, creating an environment of constant fear. Millions of Afghans faced deep hunger and economic collapse because foreign aid, which had helped pay for food, schools, and healthcare, was drastically reduced after the Taliban took over. Humanitarian crises grew, with over 28 million people out of around 40 million needing help just to survive. A severe drought made things even worse, destroying crops and drying up water sources. Children, especially the youngest, were at high risk of malnutrition and disease, and many rural communities were left without government support in the middle of a growing catastrophe. Everyday freedoms were disappearing too, in ways that outsiders might not notice, but that devastated life inside Afghanistan. Schools that once buzzed with children became empty and silent. Girls over the age of 12 were barred from returning to secondary schools. This affected over 1 million girls, stopping them from becoming teachers, doctors, scientists, or engineers. Female teachers who had spent years in training were no longer allowed to work, even in classrooms that had mostly male students. Without school or work, entire generations of young women faced a future cut short before it had even begun. The isolation of women and girls also created serious social problems. With fewer legal protections and no safe spaces, early and forced marriages increased sharply. Families struggling financially often felt they had no choice but to marry off daughters at a very young age, pushing children into adult responsibilities long before they were ready. Taliban restrictions on movement and work also left women completely dependent on male relatives, forcing many to stay in homes where they faced domestic abuse with no access to the support services that had existed before 2021. Over the years, the Taliban's actions drew growing international condemnation. The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for top Taliban leaders, including Supreme Leader Hibatullah Akhundzada, accusing them of persecuting women and girls and punishing anyone outside their strict gender rules. This was one of the clearest acknowledgments that the Taliban's policies themselves, not just individual violent acts, could count as crimes under international law. Even 4 years into their rule, fear continues to dominate life in Afghanistan. For millions of Afghans, survival is now measured in how quietly they can live and how safely they can protect their children.